Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome to Rocky Mountain Readings, where we have been reading the beautiful book, The Golem and the Wondrous Deeds of the Maharal of Prague. And I loved yesterday's session where it told of a few dramatic tales involving the Golem and the Maharal, stories written with such mystery and intrigue and court drama. Just exciting to hear and refreshing. So, we're going to continue in this, and hopefully we're going to finish this today. So I want to go at it hard and heavy until we complete this, and hopefully we can break into a new book next week. I'm sorry, I'm just bombarded at the moment, and that's why I'm about a minute late. Nonetheless, let's just jump right in, and let's get through this today. So, Hashem willing. We're on chapter 19, an awesome tale about the ruin near Prague. Near Prague, close to the road that leads into the city, stood an old ruin. In former times, this building had been a gunpowder factory. On account of its location near the road, the authorities had to be careful of passerbys. Moreover, because it was old and full of cracks and breaches, the government did not want to repair the building. Instead, they moved the factory further away from the city to a building between the army barracks and the king's castle. Owing to its neglect, the building became more and more dilapidated, and it remained in ruin for a long time. Meanwhile, it became defiled, and demons danced there. The ruin now cast a pall of fear and terror on everyone who passed it at night. Many people averred that at night they heard something that sounded like a chorus singing. Others claimed that at night they saw a pack of hundreds of black dogs roving around the ruin. Another Jew swore that one night as he walked by, he saw a soldier standing on the roof playing a big flute, like the one used by the army to call soldiers to muster. All these stories prompted passerbys to carefully avoid the narrow lane next to the ruin at night and walk only on the other side. Once a Jewish merchant from Prague, who sold goods to the country folk, returned home from a village. Setting caution aside, he walked along the narrow path near the ruin, from whence a black dog ran toward him, barking. The dog circled him and then bounded back to the ruin. The terror-stricken merchant returned home. Weak in the knees, his hair bristling in fear, after telling his family about his encounter with the demonic pest, he lay down to sleep. During the night, however, the man began barking like a dog in his sleep, and his frightened family quickly woke him. In so doing, they noticed he was drenched in sweat and lay there, thoroughly drained and exhausted. I dreamed I was riding on a black dog, he told them, along with many other men who, like me, were riding in one row in an orderly manner, just like soldiers. When all the riders began barking like dogs, I too was forced to bark, for I had been warned that if I refused to bark, the dogs would devour me alive then and there. And that's why I, too, had to bark with all my might. The members of his family pooh-poohed the dream and tried to convince him that it was no cause for alarm. It's only your thoughts before falling asleep that prompted a dream like this. If you stopped thinking such thoughts during the day, they suggested, you would have a restful sleep. But in the middle of the next night, the merchant resumed his barking of the previous night. And so it continued from one night to the next until he became feeble and no longer had the strength to walk. His flesh grew lean and he became impoverished, for he had become too frail to provide for his family, who were now weak with hunger. When the family realized the extent of their misfortune, the merchant gathered his last reserve of strength and went with his wife and little children to the Maharal's house. They came to him weeping profusely. "Save us, please," they cried. The merchant told the Maharal tearfully everything that had happened to him. "My children are dependent on me," he said, "and I can't earn a living. My little ones are asking for bread, and there is none." "Inspect the man's ritual fringes," was the first thing the Maharal ordered, "to see if they are kosher." One fringe was found defective. Then the Maharal bade, "Examine and the man's tefillin." His hand tefillin was also found to have a flaw. "That's why the merchant doesn't have divine protection," the Maharal declared, "and that's why he has fallen into mud and filth, which is unclean, because it is written, 'For he will order his angels to guard you wherever you go.' This means that 2 angels accompany every Jew to protect him from evil occurrences, and these angels are created from the 2 mitzvahs of ritual fringes and tefillin. One can see that his is so, for according to gematria, the sum of the letters of the above verses equals the sum of the letters of ritual fringes and 2 tefillin. That is why the Maharal told the merchant, first repair your ritual fringes and your tefillin to make them kosher, and then immerse yourself in the ritual bath. Then the Maharal called his scribe and told him to write on kosher parchment the following amulet. No dog shall bark at any of the Israelites. No dog bark, bark no dog, no dog bark, no bark dog, no dog no bark no, bark dog no, no dog bark. Before you go to sleep at night, the Maharal decreed, tie this amulet to your forehead with the writing facing outward. He also told the merchant, do not sleep at home for the next 7 nights, but go to the courtroom and sleep in Yudl the Golem's bed. And then the rabbi turned to Yudl the Golem, and for those 7 nights you will sleep in the merchant's bed. Everyone obeyed the Maharal's orders. The man's sleep was sweet, his strength returned, and he was vigorous and healthy as in former times. The wondrous tale about Duke Bartholomew. A very wealthy duke once lived in a big, beautiful village several kilometers east of Prague. He owned 10 villages and many fields and forests. The duke's village had a spacious park where one could meditate, and in whose midst stood a small palace with a high tower topped with a short spire. Surrounding the palace was a thick wall and a deep, magnificent moat, over which, at one point, hung an iron drawbridge suspended by thick chains. This palace was absolutely empty. Nothing was in it, but in the middle of the 2 long marble headstones lay side by side above what were obviously 2 graves. 2 names were engraved on the marble. On one stone, the name of the mother, and on the other, the name of the son. There's a wonderful story about this mother and this son. In former times, the old duke named Bartholomew, who liked Jews, lived in that village. His sole offspring was an only son born late in his life. In his 10 villages lived many Jews who managed all of the duke's business affairs, which provided them with an excellent livelihood. Shalom, Ashley G. After the duke became a widower, in order to forget his sorrow, he had the custom of visiting the Jewish villagers' homes with his son. He was especially fond of greeting his Jews on Sabbath and holidays. At one Jew's house, he would eat fish, at a second potato pudding, and so on. In the duke's village lived a rich Jewish leaseholder named Moshe, who had a beautiful and intelligent daughter, the same age as the duke's son. The duke's son found the leaseholder's daughter attractive, and he always liked to talk to her. Once, when the old duke and his son were visiting the leaseholder on a Sabbath, eating fish and drinking wine, the old duke said to the Jewish farmer, Moshe, I want you to know if your daughter would consent to convert, my son would marry her. And for her sake, you too will benefit from this, for I will cancel your leaseholder's rental fee. The duke's words cut the leaseholder to the quick, but he wisely he made naught of the duke's remarks and replied with a faint smile, it would not be a fitting match for your son, nor to this couple, I don't know why, 78, nor a good bargain for him, for he can easily get a beautiful, rich, and educated girl who also stems from a distinguished ducal family. In my eyes, the duke replied with a laugh, the Jewish lineage is more distinguished than that of a duke. They spoke no more of this matter, but the leaseholder knew that the duke's remark was not mere empty talk. For as the proverb has it, when wine goes in, secrets go out. The leaseholder feared that his daughter might be destined to fall into the hands of the duke's son. He therefore hurriedly arranged a match for her, and she was engaged to an excellent Torah scholar, an orphan from a fine Prague family, and soon the wedding was celebrated in all its splendor. A year after the wedding, a son was born to this couple, and they ate at the table of their father, Moshe the leaseholder. 1 year later, the plague spread through the entire land. Entire families succumbed so quickly there was not enough grave diggers to bury them immediately, and many families fled to other lands, not knowing who was alive and who had died. In short, the villagers ran to wherever their legs carried them, and many did not know where their friends had gone. Shalom, Sheila, welcome. The epidemic did not spare the duke's villages either. Moshe, the leaseholder, and his wife died. Some of the his children living in the village died too, and some fled to another country. The son-in-law he had brought from Prague also died, leaving only the leaseholder's young daughter with her baby boy. Since the gravediggers did not come quickly enough to bury her family, she could no longer remain in the house with the dead, and she too fled with her son. Not knowing where to turn, she entered the Duke's park to seek some repose from her misery. When the old Duke and his only son learned of this, they pitied her and her baby boy. They gave her a separate house in the Duke's courtyard and provided her with everything she needed. In Prague and in all the Duke's villages as well, people assumed that the leaseholder's entire family had perished. In time, the leaseholder's daughter forgot her misfortune and began to adorn herself to look attractive in the way she had done during her youth. The Duke's only son gradually began to draw closer to her until soon they were so bound with the bonds of love that they decided to bind themselves in marriage. To conceal the fact that she was a leaseholder's daughter, she and her little son were secretly sent to Venice. After a wet nurse was engaged there for the baby boy, the wedding was soon celebrated in that city. Welcome, Patricia. The old Duke spread the word in his village that his only son had married the daughter of the king's counselor in Venice, and that they would come back in a year. During this time, all went well with the newly married pair. They traveled to many lands, as was the custom among dukes. Only after a year and a half did the new couple return to the village amid great honor. No one even dreamed that the young duke's wife was Jewish, the daughter of Moshe, the leaseholder. For with no one left of his family, his name had already been forgotten in the village. They also let it be known that she had given birth to a boy in Venice, who was now being tended by a wet nurse and would be brought back to his parents in the village after he was weaned. Not long thereafter, the old Duke died, and all his wealth and all his lands and all his ducal title were inherited by his only son. Half a year later, after he had been weaned, the baby boy was brought to the village. Since his name was Yaakov, he was listed in the village birth registry as Yaakov Bartholomew, the son born to the young Duke. The young Duke loved his Jewish wife very much, and they lived happily. In the village, she gave birth to two beautiful girls. This young Duke also loved the Jews who dwelled in his villages, and he let them manage all his businesses and followed in his father's footsteps. But in one matter, he did ill, and this is what he did. Because the young Duke knew the truth, that his little boy was of Jewish stock, and that because everything seeks its roots, he feared the boy might convert and ruin his entire estate. Therefore, he came up with an idea of attempting to plant the poison of anti-Semitism in Yaakov's heart. He engaged tutors whom he knew were vehement anti-Semites and ordered them to teach the boy to despise the people of Israel. In doing so, the teachers rooted in the boy's heart a hatred of Jews that kept increasing as time went by, to the point where he scrupulously avoided even speaking to a Jew. The young Duke's three children grew in beauty and learning. His wife's son, Yaakov Bartholomew, married the daughter of an army officer, and his two daughters were married in other countries and left their father's house for their husbands' homelands. Now, the only people in the Duke's house were Yaakov Bartholomew and his wife. Years passed. The Duke died at the age of 60, and his wife, the Jewish daughter of the leaseholder, was left a widow. She now lived with her son, Yaakov, who inherited all the wealth and all the villages and the ducal title as well. The young Duke began to rule over the 10 villages, but this created a new misfortune since he had had only anti-Semitic tutors and had been accustomed from his youth to anti-Jewish teachings. A great hatred for Jews remained in his heart, and so he began to oppress them and make all the Jews who lived in the 10 villages miserable. Little by little, he deprived them of their livelihood. At first, he burdened the Jews with extra taxes. Then he decided to expel them from the villages altogether and let others manage all of his business affairs. According to this decree of banishment, about 100 Jewish families would have had to pick up their Wondrous staff and seek livelihood elsewhere. With the unfortunate time drawing near, the Jews got together and decided to go to Prague and seek the Maharal's counsel about the impending calamity. They met the Maharal and, amid tears, poured out their bitter hearts to him. Have pity on us and on our families, they begged him. Save us so that we can stay in our homes and maintain our livelihood. But the Maharal replied, I have no advice for you now. Nevertheless, I have hope and confidence that heaven will very likely inspire me with a plan how to save you. Now return to your homes and pray to God in heaven. Don't tell anyone you came to ask me for help, but come back to see me in a week. That night, the father of the new duke appeared from the upper world in the Maharal's dream. In it, the dead man bitterly told the Maharal the entire story. The new duke, Yaakov Bartholomew, is a Jew whom I, a Jew named Yitzhak ben Aaron Halevi from Prague, have fathered. I was the son-in-law of Reb Moshe, the leaseholder, who had lived in the duke's village. He and I died in the epidemic, leaving my wife, Moshe, the leaseholder's daughter, a widow with a baby boy. The duke, who died, married her, and then, lying to everyone, claimed Royce's baby, Yaakov, as his own. He told everyone that Yaakov was their son, but the truth is, he is my son. From the moment my son Yaakov Bartholomew took over governing all the villages and began to oppress and tyrannize all the Jews who lived in his villages and deny them the opportunity of making a living by the decree of expulsion from all his villages, the dead man complained woefully. Their prayers and tears have ascended to heaven. That's why I feel so terribly tormented in the upper world, where I suffer embarrassment, humiliation, and persecution. They give me no peace there, and I have now driven me back to this world to set aright what my son has done. I have appeared several times to my son in a dream, the dead man continued, telling the Maharal, and informed him that he is a Jew by birth and that his mother is a Jew. To accent the truth of my statement, I explained that he can see for himself that he was circumcised. In the dream, I have asked him to leave the poor Jews alone and let them stay in their homes. But does he pay any attention to dreams? That is why I am earnestly requesting you in this dream to have pity on my soul and to formulate a wise and intelligent plan to make the Duke, my son, cancel his evil scheme. And please don't say you don't have the power to save the community, for I have heard in the true world, the dead man concluded, telling the Maharal that only you with your extraordinary wisdom can accomplish this salvation. The next day, the Maharal told the Shemesh, Reb Avron Chaim, I want you to thoroughly investigate the truth of the assertion that a Jewish leaseholder named Moshe with a daughter named Royce had once lived in the Duke's village, and that in Prague, at that time, a young man named Yitzhak ben Aaron Halevi became that leaseholder's son-in-law. Reb Avron Chaim researched the municipal records and also inquired of the elders. He ascertained that indeed it is all true and correct. And when the old Shemesh reported this to the Maharal, the rabbi declared, now that we have verified the words of the dead man whom I saw in my dream, what he heard in the true world about me saving them is also surely true. And if so, we have to come up with a plan how to save them. And this was the Maharal's wonderful idea. After learning that Duke Bartholomew attended services in the cloister in Prague every Sunday, the Maharal wrote the following letter in the local language. My dear son, I have come from the upper world to inform you that I, Yitzhak ben Aaron Halevi from Prague, am your real father. I was the first husband of your mother, Royce, who lives with you. She is the daughter of a Jew, Moshe, the leaseholder, who once lived in your village during the old Duke's reign. I and my father-in-law, Moshe, died during the epidemic, and it was I who named you Yaakov. And now I have come to ask you not to harm the Jews who have dwelled among you in the villages from time immemorial. I've already told you this several times in dreams, but seeing that you pay no heed to dreams, I was obliged to come down to you from the upper world myself and hand you this letter pertaining to this matter. Because ever since the tears of these oppressed families have risen up to heaven, I have no repose, only bitter and severe torments. And whether you realize the truth of this from the fact that you are circumcised like all other Jews, or whether you ask your mother and tell her what happened to you during your trip and show her this letter, you will no longer be able to deny this, but will be forced to admit that all this is indeed true. I also want you to know, my son, that if you need advice on any matter, consult the rabbi of the Jews of Prague. Do whatever he tells you, and you will succeed. Your father, Yitzhak ben Aaron Halevi. This was the text of the letter. And on the day Duke Yaakov Bartholomew had planned to come to the cloister in Prague, the Maharal summoned Yudl the Golem in the morning and handed him the letter. He also gave him the famous amulet that made him invisible. On the road to Prague near the city, the route that the Duke took was a little hill where all the wagons slowed down. Go to that hill, the Maharal told Yudl the Golem, and wait there and with the letter until the Duke's covered wagon drawn by 4 horses starts climbing the hill. Then approach his wagon, put the letter in the Duke's lap, move away calmly, and come back home. Yudl the Golem followed all the Maharal's instructions. When the Duke suddenly saw the letter on his lap, he became very frightened. He turned this way and that, but saw no one. He opened the letter and realized that no one but his dead father could have sent it, and a pall of terror came over him. Returning to his home, the Duke questioned his mother thoroughly about this matter and showed her the letter. She, too, was very astounded and scared. All of this is true, she admitted, and it is not right to persecute these Jewish families, for they are our brothers and sisters. If so, what will become of us? Duke Yaakov Bartholomew asked his mother. Completely bewildered, I was born a Jew and made a Christian without my knowledge. Now I don't know to which camp I belong. The next day, the Duke sent his covered wagon to the Maharal with a letter requesting that he come to his house. At once, the Maharal knew the reason for the invitation, and some years later, and gave an order to inform all the Jews of the villages that their salvation had come. The Maharal visited the Duke and spent an entire day and night there, but what he spoke of he did not wish to reveal. Only this was known to all, that the Duke, Yaakov Bartholomew, gave the Maharal a vast sum of money for a good cause. The Maharal used the money to establish a big yeshiva in Prague and immediately named it the Bet Yaakov Yeshiva in honor of its founder, Duke Yaakov Bartholomew. As for the Jewish families who lived in his villages, obviously they were not expelled. On the contrary, the Duke greatly reduced their rents, and from that time forward he greeted every Jew cordially with a cheerful countenance. Some years later, Duke Yaakov Bartholomew built his famous palace in the middle of his park and beautified it with all kinds of adornments. He prepared 2 graves there, one for his mother and one for himself, so that after their deaths they would not have to be buried in the Christian cemetery, for they obviously could not be buried in the Jewish cemetery either. With no other choice, they had to be buried in a separate grave in the park. Interesting. Okay, the blood libel in Prague during the Maharal's lifetime. 3 years passed in peace, and thanks to the Maharal, neither Prague nor the rest of the country experienced any blood libel tragedy, for the enemies of Israel trembled with fear upon hearing of the wondrous deeds of the Maharal, who, by virtue of his great wisdom, was able to uncover all mysteries. Nevertheless, in 1589, another terrible blood libel took place in Prague. Here is what happened. A very rich man of a good family named Reb Aaron Gins lived in Prague. He was both learned and prosperous. In him, Torah learning and eminence were combined. He had 3 married daughters and supported his 3 scholarly sons-in-law who continuously studied Torah. He also had 3 sons and another daughter, none of whom was married. Reb Aaron's business was tanning hides. He lived with his family in a walled house in the city, and his tannery with 20 full-time employees, 12 Jews and 8 Christians, was located in a suburb. After these tanners had worked together for some years, the Christians learned to speak Yiddish just like Jews. Among the Christian workers were 3 brothers from a village 4 kilometers from Prague. They had no father, only a poor elderly mother who lived in an earthen house at the edge of the village. The 2 older brothers were called Karl Kozlovsky and Heinrich Kozlovsky, but the name of the much younger 3rd brother was not known in the tannery. He was nicknamed Kozalik because he started working in the tannery while still quite young and was a wild boy who loved to dance and prance like an imp. Ashamed of his real name, the two older brothers never wanted to reveal it. The authorities did not permit his father's family name to be recorded in the municipal birth registry, for his unmarried mother, Jadvina, had borne him 2 years after becoming a widow. Therefore, he was recorded in the birth registry as a bastard with only his mother's name. His real name was Jan. The two older brothers, already married with children, were living in Prague, and since their widowed mother was a poor washerwoman and could neither care for nor properly support her son, she pleaded with her two older sons, "Ask the tannery owner to hire our young brother, and this way he'll constantly be under your watchful eye." The brothers acceded to her request and kept asking Reb Aaron Gins about a job for Kozelik until he finally consented. When the boy started working at the tannery, he was 15 years old. After 3 years of diligent labor, he began receiving the wage of a full-fledged employee. During that period, an incident occurred that stemmed from his uninhibited frolicking, habitual with him since childhood. While jumping from one spot to another, he fell into a pit of stinking liquid in which untanned hides had been soaking. He was pulled out, injured and in pain, just barely alive, and then lay in his sickbed, ailing for 2 weeks. Surgeons also operated on his right hand and amputated 2 fingers. Gradually, Kozelik recuperated, but now he was no longer capable of doing his former tasks. For besides his maimed right hand with its missing 2 fingers, he had become physically debilitated and walked about in a state of perpetual fatigue, sometimes even spitting up blood. Reb Aaron Gins wanted to dismiss Kozelik because he was not doing his assigned job at the tannery, and he did not want to pay wages in vain. But Kozelik's 2 brothers stood up firmly to the tannery owner and did not let him be ill-treated. They adamantly demanded that Kozelik keep his job and get his former wages, and if you insist on firing him, they told the owner, we demand that you pay Kozelik a large sum of money for becoming crippled at your tannery. This disagreement between the brothers and Reb Aaron Gins prompted several arguments. Eventually, however, they compromised. Kozelik would stay on but work as a porter and sweep up the trash in the tannery and the courtyard. As for wages, they agreed he would get only half his former pay. From then on, the fire of revenge against Reb Aaron Gins smoldered secretly in the brothers' hearts, and they schemed vengeance. Since they considered the compromise a terrible injustice, and Kozelik's work, carrying everything and gathering the garbage, humiliating hard labor. In addition to his job in the tannery, he had to go to Reb Aaron's house in Prague, clean the yard, and heat up the stoves on Sabbath. Kozelik always cried in front of his brothers and bemoaned his bitter fate, for the doctors told him that tuberculosis had penetrated his body and he had constantly spat up more blood. He was disgusted with his life, and he felt he had no recourse but to abandon his job and flee while he still had living breath in him. Perhaps he would be cured once he was free. On Purim Day, toward evening, after the table had been set in his house, Reb Aaron Gins sat down with his entire family for the Purim feast. And because most people loved the rich, a host of friends and admirers came to revel in the joyous Purim feast with him. Naturally, there was no lack of intoxicating spirits. In honor of Purim, drinks were plentiful, fine wine in big silver goblets and many confections, and of course Kozelik was present too, for he had to continually attend to the guests. When they went home after midnight, Reb Aaron and his family, thoroughly exhausted, fell into a deep slumber and slept sweetly. But Kozelik used this event for his own purposes. He stole into the inner rooms of Reb Aaron's house and gathered up 10 big silver goblets and about a dozen silver spoons and forks. He also took Reb Aaron Gins' silver watch and ran away that same night. No one saw him stealing, and no one knew where he had fled. When the theft was discovered the next morning, cries rang out in Reb Aaron Gins' house, and when they saw that Kozelik had disappeared, they realized at once that the robbery was his handiwork. Reb Aaron sent for the 2 brothers and told them what their younger brother had done. And I suspect that you lured him to do the stealing, and that both the stolen goods and the thief are hidden at your house. The 2 brothers began to argue with their boss about his suspicion. We don't know a thing about it, they shouted, and we can't possibly know where our brother has run off to, for he's an orphan with no family. The 2 brothers did not want to reveal that they still had an elderly mother because they knew their brother had sought refuge with her. As soon as Reb Aaron would learn about their old mother, he would surely rush there at once with policemen to search her house. Reb Aaron informed the police chief about the theft, and the letter was sent to his men to search the brothers' houses, but they found nothing suspicious in them. This whole incident deepened the brothers' hatred of Reb Aaron, although they continued to work in his tannery and had drawn their livelihood from it for 10 years. They decided to take their revenge on him. Late on Friday afternoon, just as the doors of the tannery were closing for 2 days, the two brothers made their way to the impoverished mother to find out what was happening there. Upon their arrival, they saw their brother Kozlik lying in a sick bed. He could no longer speak, for he was dying. After fleeing from Prague during the night, he had become overheated while running and caught cold. At his mother's house, blood spurted from his throat, and his body succumbing to the tuberculosis. He fell unconscious. He was still in bed when the brothers arrived on the Friday night and died soon thereafter at the same night. The two brothers tried to have Kozlik buried on Sunday in the village cemetery, but since they had no money to pay the local priest for a proper Christian burial with all the traditional religious rituals, they took with them Reb Aaron Gin's watch that Kozlik had stolen. They came to the priest with the following request. Our mother's third son just died. She's a poor old widow without a penny to her name except for this silver watch she has from her husband. We brothers are poor too, and the little bit of money we had used for other burial expenses. That's why we're asking you to please take the silver watch in exchange for burial. We don't want to trouble you, they added, to bury him with elaborate Christian ceremony. We just want permission to have him buried, and we'll do that quietly. The priest agreed. He took the watch from them, and he gave them permission to bury their brother in the village Christian graveyard. In the death registry book, he recorded the day and date when Jan, the son of Jadvina, was buried. On Sunday evening, Kozlik was buried without fanfare by his mother, his two brothers, and the old gravedigger. Except for them, no one knew of this, for Jadvina lived at the edge of the village near the cemetery. When they returned after the burial, the two brothers sold all the stolen items in the village and gave their mother the money. Then they left and returned to Prague. The following morning, on Monday, the two brothers, exhausted from their journey, did not get to the tannery until noon. Why so late? An angry Reb Aaron rebuked them. Why couldn't you come to work on time this morning? Along with his reprimand, he also heaped scorn on them about the theft. And you no doubt got yourselves drunk these last 2 days and 3 nights with the money you got from the stolen goods. This insult infuriated the two brothers. They were so enraged they could not even respond and proceeded to their work. But because they had their fill of their boss, they secretly decided that the time for revenge had come. At night, the two brothers conspired and pondered the manner of vengeance against their master. They agreed on the following plan. Since no one knew where their brother Kozlik had fled to, and no one in the village knew about their brother's death and burial, they could easily use this incident to initiate a blood libel against their boss by means of Kozlik's corpse. That very week, they chose a night to execute their evil scheme. The two brothers came to the village where Kozlik was buried. Under the cover of darkness, they opened his grave, stole his body from the coffin, and lowered the corpse into the ground. While doing so, they spoke loudly, mockingly, and in an unruly manner in Yiddish, for they were fluent in that tongue. They did all this to attract the attention of passerby and to elicit questions about what they were doing here. Just then, a wagon with Christian passengers came by. When they heard the mocking tone of the gravediggers, they stopped the wagon. Who are you, they asked, and what are you doing here? We're Jewish gravediggers, the two brothers replied in Yiddish, and then added, laughing, when a wild, nasty, and filthy young fellow who was neither Jewish nor Christian died, the Jews didn't want to bury him in the cemetery, but only under the fence. And since for us Jews it's a shame to bury such an abominable creature during the day, they told us to bury this corpse in the dark of night. The Christian travelers accepted this explanation. Once they saw the body placed into the grave, they immediately resumed their journey to the next village. The two brothers then took the bundle of clothes, the boots, and Kozlik's hat, all items very well known to all the tannery workers, put them into a bag, and set out for Prague. Then, under the cover of night, they sneaked into the cellar of Reb Aaron Gin's house and hid the bundle of Kozlik's clothes in a pile of sand they found there. They left while it was still dark, and no one knew a thing about their evil deed. The next morning, the two brothers spread a rumor in several places where crowds gathered. Some Christians who live in a village near Prague told us that 2 nights ago they saw Jews burying a Gentile boy under the fence of a Jewish cemetery. These Jews said that they were bearing an atonement sacrifice, and to this rumor, the two brothers added, "This must be the sacrifice of a Christian who has fallen into the hands of the Jews so they can mix Christian blood into their matzahs, for it's a custom to call such a sacrifice an atonement." This rumor flew quickly from one end of the city to the other, and naturally, at the time, there were many Jew haters in Prague who, for some years, had been yearning to accuse the Jews of ritual murder, but were unsuccessful. Now that they had the story with the passing of each day, they began to spread it with increasing frequency. Some people began to inquire in all the Christian houses to learn if any Christian had disappeared recently. The two brothers also helped to spread the nefarious rumor in the city. They let it be known quietly that they had learned from a trustworthy source that the sacrifice buried by the Jews was a Christian boy named Kozlik, who had worked for several years for the Jewish tannery owner, Reb Aaron Gins. When this Kozlik was heard at the tannery, his master concluded that he was now very weak and no longer fit for work. Since the owner could not get rid of him, he hit upon the idea of using him as a sacrifice for the Passover holiday. On the night of their Purim feast, when the master had many guests and had drunk lots of wine, they also gave young Kozlik lots of wine to drink and made him so drunk he fell asleep. Then they brought him down to the cellar where they slaughtered him. To avoid falling under suspicion, the morning after the Purim feast, the factory owner spread the rumor that Kozlik had robbed him in the night before and fled. What the brothers said spread with increasing intensity all over Prague until it reached the chief of police and his men. And inasmuch as many questions were being asked of him in high places as to why he did not thoroughly investigate this matter, he was obliged to intervene. The police chief and his men went to that village near Prague. They rigorously questioned the Christians who had traveled that night and witnessed the burial. They later described all they had seen. On his way back to Prague, the police chief brought along several villagers to point out where the burial had taken place. After the chief came home, he sent a messenger to summon, one by one, the Maharal and the 3 heads of the community, each of whom was known as the primus, as well as the 2 gravediggers. He thoroughly questioned each of them separately and asked them to explain who was ordered to be buried beneath the cemetery fence. But each man gave the same reply. They knew nothing of this. They assured him that such an incident had never happened and that the anti-Semites were just looking for a pretext for a blood libel. Then the police chief, accompanied by his officers and several Jewish gravediggers, went to the burial site where they looked for and found the grave. They took the corpse out of the grave, removed the dirty blood-stained sheet, and lay the body on the ground in the presence of all assembled in order to identify him. Meanwhile, a great crowd had gathered in front of the cemetery, among them the 2 brothers who had secretly fabricated this entire misfortune. When the corpse was shown to the public, the 2 brothers burst out of the crowd and fell with their faces to the ground in front of the body. "Oh, woe, my brother," they cried loudly, wailing and lamenting first. They turned to the crowd and shouted, "Look, look, what those damned Jews have done to us. Come and look, all of you, how the cursed Jew Aaron, that tannery owner, slaughtered our younger brother." And then they asked their friends and co-workers at the tannery to confirm that the dead boy was indeed the worker, Kozlik. They recognized him at once. The brothers pointed out the starkest sign for everyone to see, the 2 missing fingers of his right hand that the doctors had amputated. The screams and wails of the 2 brothers agitated the mob. They became enraged and wanted to attack the Jews then and there and tear them to pieces. But despite the police chief's order to all the policemen and soldiers present to prevent violence, the crowd began throwing stones from afar at every Jew they saw. A calamity was about to take place, an outbreak of violence against all Jewish homes. But the mob was thwarted only because of the Maharal's efforts. He rushed to the police chief and requested severe measures to ensure that no harm befall Jewish homes and property until the matter was brought before judges to determine beyond a doubt whether the 2 brothers' claim was true or not. In the end, the truth will be revealed and everyone will see that this accusation is false, the Maharal assured him. The police chief agreed with him and protected the Jewish quarter from looting and violence. But this did not stop the 2 Kozlovsky brothers. Make a thorough search of Reb Aaron Ginn's cellar was their further request of the police chief. Rumor has it that our brother Kozlik was slaughtered in that very cellar. So you might very well find traces of his blood or other evidence to confirm the truth of the rumor. The police chief was obliged to follow their suggestions, along with many policemen and soldiers, as well as the two brothers and some of their friends who worked at the tannery. The police chief suddenly set upon Reb Aaron Ginn's house. They made a thorough search, even digging into the earthen floor of the cellar and the pile of sand. There they found Kozlik's bundle of clothes, which the two brothers and their co-worker friends recognized at once. Afterward, Reb Aaron Ginn's and his 3 sons-in-law were arrested. Their wives and children were also brought to the jail. The police chief locked Reb Aaron Ginn's residence and his tannery and placed the royal seal on them. The following day, many priests arrived carrying their flags, accompanied by a mass of people. They dressed the body of the boy in his clothes found in the cellar. Then they eulogized him amid sermons full of abuse and contempt against Jews and bore him aloft with great honor to the cloister. Before taking him out for burial, the priest sent a message to the police chief with a request to bring the murderous Jew to the cloister. For according to the law of their religion, the murderer had to confess his crime in the presence of his victim and beg for his forgiveness. The police chief could not contravene Christian law, and under heavy guard of many police and soldiers, had Reb Aaron Ginn sent in chains to the cloister. When they placed him in front of the boy's body in the cloister, Reb Aaron was terrified. His face turned white as chalk. Then the head priest approached. "Your hands have spilt this innocent blood and slit the throat of this corpse," he declared. "But you can now rectify your crime somewhat by asking the corpse for forgiveness and sewing upon the dead boy's throat with your own hands." Sewing up the dead boy's throat with your own hands. "As my hands did not slit his throat," Reb Aaron replied, "so they will not sew up this throat." The entire throng assembled there raged against Reb Aaron Ginn's. The crowd wanted to attack him and tear him apart like a fish for his impudence towards the priest. But the policemen and his soldiers who surrounded Reb Aaron did not let anyone approach. The head priest then turned to Reb Aaron once more. "Can't you see how your crime has been revealed like the light of day?" he said. "The judges will no doubt sentence you to death. Therefore, I want you to know that if you confess before the corpse and sew up the throat you have slit, you will be doing your soul a favor, and if you'll only admit your guilt and tell us who enticed you to commit this crime, you won't come to heaven bearing such a burdensome sin." "My son, soul doesn't need any favors," was Reb Aaron's reply, "for it is innocent of this crime." Seeing they were getting nowhere with him, the priests ordered him returned to the prison. Then Kozlik was brought to the Christian cemetery in Prague with great pomp and splendor. Meanwhile, the Jews of Prague were terrified and filled with gloom. They feared walking the streets of the Christian quarter, and the city of Prague was dumbfounded. This blood libel frightened the Maharal too, and he went about sadly, for he also lost his credibility in the eyes of the authorities, who saw that all his hope was in vain. He had promised the police chief that soon the truth about this false accusation would surface, but now the opposite held true. Since there was no defensible explanation for the bundle of Kozlik's clothing hidden in the sand in Reb Aaron Ginn's cellar, although the Maharal knew full well that this was a false accusation and realized that this libel was cunningly engineered, he could not say anything and did not dare speak out now. And so he kept silent. Still, he ordered the entire community to publicly recite psalms during all the morning services until the conclusion of the blood libel trial, not wanting to ordain a fast during the month of Nisan. But this misfortune brought on another. The priests of Prague issued proclamation and warnings to the Christians to take care not to enter into Jewish homes or even into their shops, for any Christian who entered a Jewish home could not be sure of his life and would be committing a deadly sin. The masses heeded the priest's warning, and the livelihood of the Jews came to an end. Seeing the scope of this great calamity, which brought many other troubles in its wake, and sensing he had no more ideas of how to bring about salvation, the Maharal directed a dream question to heaven. There's a unique idea, a dream question to heaven. He got a clear answer composed of the following words: "You shall investigate and inquire and interrogate thoroughly, and your children shall return to their land." This answer invigorated the Maharal and caused him to rejoice. "Now there is hope. The truth will be revealed," he consoled his congregation. The day of the trial approached on the 1st of Sivan, the day of the new moon. The Maharal also sat in the courtroom. However, there were more irrefutable proofs to convict Reb Aaron than to exonerate him. In short, the judges rendered a guilty verdict against Reb Aaron Gins and his 3 sons-in-law and sentenced them to 15 years of hard labor, while each of their wives was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment. Only the children were exempt from punishment and were freed at once. This verdict saddened all the Jews of Prague, and the Maharal, too, was dejected. Nevertheless, the Maharal, unable to sleep, did not rest, nor was he still. It was absolutely clear to him that Kozlik had died suddenly from tuberculosis in the place to which he had fled, and there he was buried. Later, his brothers stole the body and brought it to Prague. They also stripped Kozlik's body of its clothing and stole into Aaron Gin's cellar. And learning from the tannery workers that the brothers were born in the village 4 kilometers from Prague, the Maharal then sent wise and diligent men to that village to find out all they could about the Kozlovsky family. There they discovered their family history and the address of their widowed mother, but they could not get the woman to say a word about her young son Kozlik. "I haven't seen him since I sent him to his 2 bigger brothers," she insisted. "It seems to me he's in Prague working in the tannery with his 2 brothers. The men returned to the Maharal with no further information. But when he heard that the mother's village was indeed the brothers' hometown and that it too had a Christian cemetery, the Maharal declared, "Now the way has been cleared for me to learn the truth, and I will be obliged to use supernatural forces. Every dead man's soul," he added, "must hover over his grave no less than 12 months after his death. For during the first year, the soul still has a slight connection with the body of the deceased. But if the dead person is not in his grave, then his soul is not discernible above the grave. However, not everyone, only men of lofty attributes, and animals, beasts, and birds too, can see these souls. And Yudl the Golem has the capability to see these souls, just like the animals, beasts, and birds. That is why the Maharal asked the government to let him send 2 men to examine the outside of all graves dug during the last 3 months in the village's Christian cemetery. Thus, he would be able to learn from which grave a body had recently been stolen. The Maharal's 2 emissaries, accompanied by the 2 policemen, traveled to the village. After sending for the grave diggers, they all went to the Christian cemetery. The inspection commenced, just as the Maharal, with his amazing insight, had expected. So it was. For Yudl the Golem placed himself next to a grave and signaled it was empty. There was no corpse in it. One of the policemen rushed back to Prague and told this to the police chief. This news was also immediately conveyed to the Maharal. The chief, accompanied by many of his men, went at once to the village. So did the Maharal and several community notables. The grave diggers opened the grave in their presence, removed the coffin, lifted the cover, and saw it was empty. The police chief interrogated the priest meticulously to try to remember who had come to request a permit to bury the dead body. "The 2 brothers of the dead youth came to me," the priest recalled, "but since they had no money to pay for a burial permit, they asked me to take a silver watch for the permit." The priest then took the watch from his pocket and showed it to the police chief. When it was discovered that the silver watch was among the items stolen from Reb Aaron, the police chief took it and sent a quick carriage to the city. He asked the coachman to show the watch to Reb Aaron for him to confirm by identifying marks whether it was his. Even at a distance, Reb Aaron immediately recognized his watch. Moreover, he mentioned, but after the chief slapped her face twice. Oh, hold on. Recognized his watch. Moreover, he mentioned an exterior mark and also an interior one, which was not visible from the outside. The coachman then sped back to the village and told the police chief that the prisoner had identified his watch at once. He showed the chief both the exterior and interior signs that Reb Aaron had mentioned. The police chief's conclusion was that a false blood accusation had been secretly concocted against Reb Aaron. Accompanied by all his men, the chief now left the cemetery to burst into the widow's house. "Where is your young son Jan?" he bellowed. "I haven't seen him since I sent him to his brothers in Prague to work in the tannery." Jadvina repeated her earlier denial, trying to conceal the matter even from the police chief. But after the chief slapped her face twice, she fell to his feet, wailing and pleading, "Stop, and I'll tell you the whole truth." The policeman stood her up in front of the chief, and she confessed, telling the entire story truthfully from beginning to end. "My young son came to me with the stolen items. He grew weaker and died in my house. Then his brothers came to visit him and buried him." She also told the chief where in the village the brothers had sold the stolen goods. The police chief immediately ordered a search of that house, where they found all of the stolen items. "Who sold you all of these things?" the chief demanded. "The two Kozlovsky brothers sold them to me," the buyer replied. The chief ordered the arrest of both the widow, Jadvina, and the man who had bought the stolen articles, and sent them to prison in Prague to stand judgment. On his return to Prague, the police chief did not go home. Rather, he and his entire force burst into the house of the two Kozlovsky brothers to find and arrest them. But they were no longer at home, for they had surely heard that the truth would soon be known, prompting them to flee Prague to some unknown location. The government authorities then concluded that the two brothers alone had secretly fabricated this blood libel. Reb Aaron Gins and all the members of his family were immediately freed, and the city of Prague was festive and happy. After this incident, the Maharal's repute spread throughout the world, and his fame in all the lands. Fear and dread overcame all the anti-Semites. In other countries, too, the furor over the blood libel abated. The Maharal then recorded this event from beginning to end in the form of a letter, as it is reported here, and sent it to King Rudolph. He also included a request for an audience with the king, for he had something of great import to discuss with him face to face. The king acceded to the Maharal's request. A few days later, he sent a beautiful covered carriage with two high-ranking ministers to bring the Maharal to the king's palace. When the Maharal appeared before the king, he fell face down at his feet and wept. Put an end, he implored, to the evil anti-Semites who constantly aspire to pour scorn and humiliation on the Jews by means of the false accusations of ritual murder. The Maharal then asked the king, "Please issue an edict to all the courts in your land to annul all blood libel trials brought before them, for the sin of punishing and tormenting perfectly innocent people is borne by your entire kingdom." The king was very astounded that the Maharal had fallen at his feet amid tears and pleading. He himself seized the rabbi's arms and requested of him, "Rise up from the floor." The king honored the Maharal by offering him a seat next to him in a chair already prepared for him. The Maharal spoke to the king for an hour about certain matters and then was sent home with equally great honor, but he did not want to reveal what they had discussed. 1 week later, the king promulgated an edict to all the courts in his domain, prohibiting any further blood libel trials, and the land was tranquil. Whew. How the Maharal brought about the end of the Golem. After the promulgation of King Rudolph's new law abolishing blood libel trials in his domain, the Maharal noticed a period of calm. Another Passover holiday had come and gone, and nowhere in all the king's realm was there a hint of blood libel misfortune. Then the Maharal summoned me, his son-in-law, Rabbi Yitzhak Katz, and his student and assistant in the rabbinic courtroom, Rabbi Yaakov Sasson Halevi, who with me had participated in the creation of the Golem. From this day on, the Maharal told us, there is no longer any need for the Golem, since blood libel trials are now prohibited in these lands. This event took place on the night of Lag BaOmer in 1590. The Maharal told Yossel the Golem, "Tonight you will not sleep in the courtroom, but rather carry your bed up to the attic of the great synagogue, where you will lie down to sleep." The Golem obeyed. Now it was almost midnight, a time when no one sees or hears what is happening. At 2 hours after midnight, I, his son-in-law, Rabbi Yitzhak Katz, and his student, the rabbinic judge, Rabbi Yaakov Sasson Halevi, stood before the Maharal, the rabbi at his table, posed the following question to us. Can a dead man like Yosel the Golem transfer impurity to another person? The Maharal's incisive reasoning was that even if after his death the golem would remain flesh and bones like all other human beings, the issue of impurity was not applicable to him, especially since the Maharal had understood from the beginning that after the golem's death he would once again be a pile of clay and dust, just as he was before he was created. Therefore, the Maharal took me up to the attic to participate in the death of the golem, even though I am a Cohen. This is how the golem's life ended. All three of us went up to the attic. The golem was asleep in his bed. The Maharal also permitted the old Shemesh, Reb Avron Chaim, who held 2 lit tapers in his hands, to follow, but he was ordered to stand a bit further back. All three of us stood by the golem's head to bring about his demise. All we had to do now was reverse what we had done when the golem had been formed and brought to life. And just as we had once stood at his feet facing his head and circled him 7 times, starting on his right side, we now stood by his head facing his feet and began to circle him, starting on his left side, in order to withdraw from him his soul and his spirit. Now, too, we circled him 7 times. Each circuit began on the left side of his head and continued around his feet to the right side of his head. Then we stopped and, following the Maharal's instruction, recited some combinations of letters. This we did after each of the 7 circuits. The combinations of letters we recited now were the very same we had recited during the creation of the golem, but now we said them backward. Anyone who had an understanding of practical Kabbalah and a thorough familiarity with the book of creation will grasp the secret of the creation process as well as the secret of annulling it. Now, this book of creation is something said to have been written by Abraham himself. Earliest Kabbalah books. After the 7 circuits, the golem remained lying on his bed like a lump of solid clay in the form of a man. Then the Maharal asked the old Shemesh Reb Avron Chaim to approach. After the Maharal took the 2 tapers from his hands, we stripped the golem of all his clothes except for his shirt, and since the attic contained many torn prayer shawls and no longer fit for ritual use, Reb Avron Chaim gathered a few of them, and we wrapped the golem's body with 2 old prayer shawls and tied them together. Then we took the golem's rigid body and, obeying the Maharal's instructions, hid him under a big pile of tattered pages from damaged holy books that were stored in the attic, so that no one would see where the golem was hidden. Bring the golem's bed and clothing down from the attic to the synagogue, and the Maharal told the Shemesh, and to prevent anyone from noticing, burn everything a little bit at a time. Afterward, we all descended from the attic, washed our hands with water, and we went to sleep. In the morning, we spread word that since something had angered the Shemesh, Yosel the golem, he ran off during the night, but no one knew where. The masses in Prague believed this. Nevertheless, a mere handful of great men in the city who possessed lofty attributes knew the truth. The second week after the golem's disappearance, the Maharal proclaimed a ban. No man or woman shall dare ascend to the synagogue attic, and no longer may it be used as a storeroom for torn or damaged holy books. His concern was obvious. People's carelessness with fire up there could easily cause a conflagration that would turn the entire synagogue into a roaring inferno. But the Maharal's close associates knew the real reason not to make known where Yosel the golem lay hidden. The Maharal's remarks concerning the golem. My saintly teacher and father-in-law, the Maharal of blessed memory, said, according to the law, the golem is not obliged to perform any of the mitzvahs, even those incumbent upon a woman and a slave. But for the sake of appearances, the Maharal ordered the golem to obey several mitzvahs for everyone to see. 2. The golem did not even have the slightest hint of either the good or the evil impulses. Everything he did stemmed from his great dread that he would immediately cease to exist. All his actions were like those of a golem, only a limited of understanding. in keeping with his level of spirituality, but he could not imbue the golem with even a minuscule amount of wisdom and knowledge, since he was not worthy of having a divine soul, either from internal or external radiance. So, I don't know what happened. Hold on. All his actions were like those of an automaton, performing tasks up to 10 cubits above and below ground posed to no difficulty for the golem. Within those limits, no barriers held for him. For the golem has the power to see spiritual things on a low level, slightly higher than animals, beasts, and birds, and slightly lower than demons and ghosts. Nevertheless, even a righteous man who possesses a divine soul and has free will cannot see spiritual things unless heaven grants him a special power for this purpose. As we read, God opened her eyes. 5. The golem was created with a special power that prevents him from being killed with any weapon. Neither can he be burned by fire nor drowned by water. The Maharal was able to draw into the golem only a limited understanding in keeping with his level of spirituality, but he could not imbue the golem with even a minuscule amount of wisdom and knowledge, since he was not worthy of having a divine soul, either from internal or external radiance. 7. There was another reason the golem could not have been created with the power of speech. He was not worthy and suitable that the divine light or the light of divine soul shine in him, for he only possessed the power of vital life and spirit, as it is written, he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. The Aramaic translation states, and man became a speaking creature. Thus, we see that the power of speech emanates only from the level of a divine soul. 8. Even though the golem does not possess itself, even though the golem does not possess a divine soul and hence cannot have an extra Sabbath soul, nevertheless, one could discern that on Sabbath his face was more luminous and appealing than on weekdays. And from this, one can understand what the Holy Zohar teaches, that on the Holy Sabbath the dominion of stern judgment is less intense than on weekdays. For these judgments are in the category of darkness, while Sabbath holiness is in the category of immense light, so powerful it crushes the dark forces. And the rays of light of Sabbath holiness spread throughout all the realms with such a great and mighty power that its influence even reaches to some small degree the great darkness, which is the source of these stern judgments. And even though it is absolutely impossible to disseminate light directly to that place, it can still shine there as it reflected light. And thus the darkness is by itself diminished, and the power of these judgments is weakened, even in a great ignoramus who has no desire for this light and no concept of what is happening. In many cases, some kind of spark of light from Sabbath holiness appears with him, and that is why our sages of blessed memory said that an ignoramus too is afraid of telling lies on the Sabbath. Wow. 9. The golem had to be created without the power of reproduction or desire for a woman. For if he had such a desire, even if only the level of beasts, which is much less than desire in human beings, he would have caused us enormous trouble. Because of his great strength and vast power in this matter, no woman would have been safe from him, as may have been seen by the verse, the sons of God saw how beautiful were the daughters of men, and they took as wives any they liked. 10. That is why the golem was not subject to any weakness or illness, for he had no desire that stemmed from the power of the evil impulses. Therefore, for him, everything physical existed on a level proper and fitting for him, according to the criteria of his body. No more and no less. Something unique in there. And if people like us could behave in like manner, we would never experience weakness and disease. Very interesting points. 11. That is why, even without a clock, the golem always knew the hour during a 24-hour period, for during every hour of the day, a different fine scent blows in mightily from the lower Garden of Eden and spreads immediately all over the world to cleanse the air we breathe and eliminate the poisons created in it. And the greatest danger is for human beings. For this, the lower Garden of Eden had 24 kinds of fine scents that contain all the medications in the world. Moreover, many kinds of grasses and plants exist that absorb these fine scents, which is why they possess the power to cure several sorts of ailments. Different. When these 24 fine scents do not cleanse the air properly, or if the fine scent cannot reach a certain place, then an epidemic, God forbid, could break out. And because the golem's olfactory sense is at the proper level of perfection, since he never suffered from any kind of defect, each hour he is able to sense that hour's ascendancy of a different fine scent. And by virtue of this, the golem can sense what hour it is. Minutes, however, he cannot discriminate. Every righteous person can achieve that level of sensitivity. And the most important thing is casting off one's physicality. 12. When the Maharal attempted to draw some life spirit into the golem, two spirits appeared before him, one of Yosef Sheda, the other of Yonasan Sheda. He chose the spirit of Yosef Sheda, for he had already helped to save Talmudic sages from many kinds of calamities, which was not the case with the spirit of Yonasan Sheda. And what is more, one can see from the Talmud that Yonasan Sheda was not a master of mystical doctrine. 13. After his death, the golem cannot transmit impurity to others because his body was not born, just made. Similarly, an animal created in like fashion does not have to be ritually slaughtered, nor does the prohibition of eating a limb torn from a living animal apply to it. If it is not considered a carcass, it cannot transmit even a drop of impurity. Hope that helps you understand some of the logic. The golem spirit 14 will return at resurrection of the dead, but not in the first body of Yosef Sheda, nor in the second body of Yosel the golem, but in a third body formed by a union of man and a woman. He will be drawn into this world before the coming of the Messiah by a righteous person who will set aright something very necessary and of great import, which is still an absolute secret, and he may be given the power to resurrect the golem's two previous bodies. As it is written, he drew upon the spirit that was on him. Whew. 15. The golem will also have a share in the world to come, not because he observed any of the particular mitzvahs of the 613 commandments, but because he saved Jews several times from great calamities. Even though he was obliged to do this, he is nevertheless worthy of reward, like a servant who is treated benevolently by his master, especially since we see that when the golem was in the body of Yosef Sheda, he did not necessarily have to perform the good deeds he did, but acted of his own free will. 16. All Jewish demons mentioned in the Zohar will be purified and have restitution by several transmigrations. Their spiritual repair will be accomplished not through Torah study or observance of mitzvahs, for they were not present when the Torah was given at Sinai, but by doing good deeds for Jews, saving them from misfortunes and persecutions, as did Yosef Sheda. In this manner, they too will be worthy of the world to come. Wow, different idea. 17. One does not have to study the combination of letters as printed in the book of creation in order to create a man or an animal. A man who studies the combinations of letters only from this book will not be able to create anything. First, because of printer's errors, and because much is missing. Second, and most important, is the comprehension in its own right that emanates from the person himself. He has to know at the outset which spiritual lights each letter hints at. Then he will also understand of his own accord the physical powers inherent in each letter. This must be studied, and even after intensive study, this matter is dependent upon the degree of the man's understanding and his righteousness. For if he is worthy, he will attain this emanation and will understand how to combine the letters and create a creature in the physical world. And even if this person writes these combinations of letters in a book, no one else will be able to make any use of them unless he knows how to meditate on the needed permutations by the power of his understanding. Otherwise, for him, these combinations will merely be like a body without a soul. Bezalel had the greatest proficiency in this matter, for he could easily create a man or animal. He also knew how to make permutations of letters that were used to create heaven and earth. Bezalel's knowledge, including all of the 600,000 letters of our Holy Torah, was achieved of his own accord through the power of his understanding. And even if he had written down the combination of letters in a book, no one else could have made any use of them if he lacked the ability of making the permutations on his own through the power of his understanding. So off limits to create another golem. The second week after the death of the golem, the Maharal prohibited anyone from going up to the synagogue attic under the pretext of the fear of a fire breaking out in the huge pile of pages from old, torn, and tattered holy books stored in there containing God's name. But he stipulated specifically that this prohibition is not applicable to any rabbinic judge who succeeded him in this rabbinic post in the holy community of Prague. He could ascend as long as he was not mortally afraid of a demon. The ban should not restrain him, but only on condition that he went up to the attic merely to look and not to make any changes there. 19. Under no circumstances did the Maharal ever want to include the golem in a quorum of 10 men. He said that even according to the opinion that a woman can be included in a minyan, the golem cannot be counted, since in this matter he is on a lower level than a woman. For in no way can he be considered an Israelite, as in the verse, I will be sanctified in the midst of the sons of Israel. Women, however, are occasionally included in the category sons of Israel. Moreover, women in any case are obliged to abide by all the halakha prohibitions of the Torah, which is not the case for the golem. Yeah, divine sense from heaven. Isn't that interesting, Patricia? What's this? Yitzhak ben Shimshon Katz of blessed memory. A note by the rabbi publisher. My friend, the great Torah scholar and pious man who is a library unto himself, the Honorable Gaon Rabbi David Hirsch, son of Rabbi Shlomo, long life to him, showed me Responsum 93 of the Chacham Zvi, wherein he expressed doubts that someone created by means of the book of creation, as we read in the Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin Rava created a man, can be included in a minyan. His grandfather, the Gaon Rabbi Eliyahu, head of the rabbinic court in Chelm, also created a man, and he concluded that he cannot be included in a minyan. Chapter 24, the miraculous events pertaining to the Maharal's engagement. The greatly honored, wealthy, and renowned Reb Shmelki Reich from the holy community of Worms took the Maharal as a husband-to-be for his daughter, Pearl, when he was 15 years old. He sent him to Zermsel to study in the yeshiva of the Gaon Maharshal of blessed memory. Meanwhile, however, the father-in-law, Reb Shmelki, had become impoverished. When the Maharal was 18, his father-in-law-to-be wrote him, because a young man of 18 is a candidate for marriage, and because I am unable to offer you a dowry, I don't want to bind you to honor your engagement contract. Therefore, we herewith forgive you in advance, and should you wish to break the engagement, give you permission to pursue another match as you see fit. The Maharal wrote back to his future father-in-law, I have no intention of going back on my word. Rather, I have hope and anticipate with the help of Hashem. And so, if you do not want to bind your daughter, arrange a match for her best first, and then I will know I am free to make other arrangements. But the father-in-law's fortunes did not improve, and the engaged girl, seeing that her father was in a poor state, rented a little shop where she sold baked goods to help her parents earn a living. For 10 years, she sat there in solitude. The Maharal, too, did not wish to enter into another match and diligently studied Torah. People called the Maharal Reb Lieb the Bachelor, and Rabbi Moshe Israels of blessed memory said that Reb Lieb, it is written, I have exalted one chosen out of the people. I have found David, my servant, for in him there is a spark of King David's soul, peace unto him. This is how the match turned out. During a war, hosts of troops came through the city. Following the soldiers was a knight. When he passed the bake shop of the Maharal's fiancée, with the tip of his spear, he pierced a large loaf of bread that lay in the window. The engaged girl ran out to him in tears. "Don't steal the bread. I am a poor maiden supporting my old and feeble parents. So what should I do if I'm starving for bread and don't have any money to pay you?" The knight shouted at her. "But I can do this, since I am sitting on 2 pack saddles. I'll give you one in exchange for the bread." The knight pulled out 1 pack saddle from under him and flung it with all his might into the shop. As the girl approached to pick it up, she was terror-stricken at seeing it was ripped open on one side and gold coins had fallen out of it. She struggled to lift the heavy pack saddle full of gold dinars, then ran to tell her parents the news. The father-in-law immediately wrote to the Maharal inviting him to the wedding, for the Holy One, blessed be he, had helped him in a miraculous way to pay the dowry and arrange an honorable wedding as befits him. I heard this story from my father-in-law, the Maharal of blessed memory, when he sat in judgment on a case pertaining to the abrogation of a match on account of poverty, where the in-law was unable to pay the promised dowry. My father-in-law of blessed memory never wanted to participate in such a case. On the contrary, he tried his best to strengthen the bonds of a match, and only if the case demanded it did he send the litigants to the judges to adjudicate the matter in their home and not in his courtroom. And I think that's the end. We've reached the notes. Interesting. I hope you folks have enjoyed these wonderful stories. I think this has just been kind of profound, but I think we need to ascertain that it's fiction, but you also do get some Jewish understanding now. Some beautiful, beautiful stuff. And like we read earlier this year, we read that book, A Jewish Guide to the Mysterious by Rabbi Pinhas Taylor, and we even had him on Rocky Mountain Readings. It was a joy to have him. In his book, he wrote a chapter on the Golem, and we can see exactly how that has come from this work. The stories that were mentioned of the Golem that he had quoted in his research all obviously came from this book. I don't know what else to say in light of it. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Patricia. I mean, there was some drama, there's some history, some intrigue, some romance, and even some spook in there. A little bit of, every genre was covered the way this Yudl Rosenberg. You can see why this was considered to be a profound success. This book was a bestseller when it debuted, and it's always a joy to see the way the Jewish people support their own authors, and may us Noahides, learn to support. And I know some of you guys have been supporting these broadcasts, and I'm so thankful. But Noahide communities are only going to blossom as people rally around those capable and support. Now, I'm thinking about next week starting. Now, I've got to work several days. I did get the call last night to go in and do a night shift, but I wasn't given any time to get any rest and prepare. And plus, I would have had to cancel today's reading. And so I said, no, I wouldn't do it. So that cost me several $100s. But the point being, last night was a full moon and Welfare Wednesday for the drug addicts out there that I end up having to work with. And there's nothing worse than them just all running around smoked up on meth or shooting up junk. Yeah. And they wanted extra security, and I don't blame them, but it was a full moon, and it was, nonetheless, I have to start working tonight for the next 4 nights, and Hashem be with me in all that I do, and my able to fulfill my duties without incident. I love these stories, how intrigued when plots go on and that they get thwarted when they're against the righteous, and so we're all waiting for great deliverance, I'm sure, to a degree. So next week, I think when we do start, I want to come back. I'm going to start with this book called The Gaon of Vilna and His Messianic Village or Vision and it's by Ari Morgenstern. So we're going to start with this book when we return next week, which will probably be Tuesday, because after working on a long weekend, I finished Monday morning at 7. There's no way I got to hit the bed, and hopefully you guys understand. But yeah, so join me next week when we get into the Gaon of Vilna, which is from Lithuania, and the Gaon means genius of Vilnius in his messianic vision. So I'm thinking that we can jump into this text and hopefully learn some great stuff, more theological, but surrounding the deliverance that will come into play with the messianic vision from an authority such as the Vilna Gaon. Excellent material. So hopefully you'll join me next week for that. But I want to thank you all for attending the Golem. I know we've knocked this off in only 4 sessions, but it's just refreshing. I mean, some of it was just, interesting stories. So we hope you enjoyed it. So I think we'll sign out for Rocky Mountain Readings for today. But please come back and see us probably Tuesday next week. We'll start with the new book. And Shabbat Shalom. I am this weekend when completed the 48 days of Israel with and you know I got sent yesterday. I got sent yesterday by Rabbi Cruz. He did a celebration event completing that 48 days, which he dedicated to the original author, Noah Weinberg, of blessed memory, of Asia Torah, where Rabbi Poston was a student back in the late 80s. And so what he sent to me yesterday was a video, 20-minute video of a celebration ceremony for completing that class there at Asia Torah, and their back window faces onto the western wall, and it's raised up so you can actually see onto the whole the Temple Mount. Anyways, I'll try and share that video on social media right after this class. But he actually had the new Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the university there at Asia Torah, get up there and say a blessing for completing that series, because so many people over the millennia or centuries have tried to redo that course, the 48 ways, and they just start. A lot of people have started but never finished, and so it was a celebration for completing it, because we did it all in video series, and it just was a great time. Plus, he had Noah Weinberg's brother, a Meshgiach there in Jerusalem, give a blessing at the end. And so I'm going to post that video out there on social media. Check it out. It's a joy to complete what you start, and you can learn a lot along the way. And that's what we're trying to encourage here with Rocky Mountain Readings, is that you can tackle big voluminous works like we did with the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. That just was huge. You see, we knocked this one off in 4 days, but that other one took 31 days of reading and really digging at it. But you can do it. Be encouraged in all that you do. Don't be afraid to tackle big mountainous projects, but learn to dice and slice and make it digestible, and do that self-assessment often, and track your progress and your goals, and you'll get to where you want to go. And I hope that you all live fulfilled lives. So blessing to you all. I'm going to sign out for today. See you next week. Shabbat Shalom.